First, I am going to talk about microeconomics. I'm not going to talk about the circumstances of what will have to be determined in Cuba at the first year or two in the revival of the future Cuban economy. To understand what I feel and think on those matters, I recommend the famous magazine or publication Herencia. That is going to come out in a few days, and I have an article there about the macroeconomics of the reconstruction of the Cuban economy. Now, about the microeconomics, which includes exports, imports, investment, indemnizations, and privatizations. I will have some comments which will be completely in opposition to what my colleague here, Jose Acel, is just thinking about and considering for the future of Cuba. I am, as I remember that Felipe Pasos at one point said about when he was giving a lecture on Venezuela many, many years ago, he said, "I'm bullish on Venezuela and I'm bullish on Cuba." I believe that if you look at the different sectors of the economy, dividing them in infrastructure, agriculture, and manufacturing, I think there are substantial opportunities. Let's begin, and I'm going to try to be, of course, limit myself to the 10 or 12 minutes that we agreed at the beginning. In services, you have the projections of several studies, and I've looked at them carefully, which contrast, by the way, with the expectations of what would happen if the Congress of the United States would suddenly open up the possibility of traveling to Cuba by American citizens, which have been estimated, surprisingly to many of you, as an average in 500,000 at the most. Which, by the way, would reduce the number of Canadians and other Europeans that go to Cuba, because it would raise the prices of everything in Cuba. So it would be, at the most, a net gain of 500,000 tourists. But if you look at Cuba in 8 years, the projections are that we would have probably an additional 5 to 7 million tourists a year. And that would mean a lot of investments. That would mean and tremendous expansion in air transport, tremendous expansion in maritime transport, which would include investments in the airports, would include investment in the ports, would imply, in fact, the possibility that some of the American enterprises that dominate tourism, cruise tourism in the world, would establish even what was common in Cuba in the 50s, administrative offices there to keep on top of what's happening in terms of the importance of that tourism in Cuba. You would have the ferry would be reestablished. We're now even talking about the ferry. We're talking about also maritime transport. Cubana de Aviación would, keeping aside what the possible indemnization, would probably have investments by other airlines, the companies who might want to buy shares in Cubana de Aviación. The airports would be tremendously improved in all of Cuba. The same thing would happen on the sea transport, tourism, but also cargo shipments and so on would be expanded tremendously, and there would be investments in Cuba by foreigners. And I agree with Jose that Cuban Americans would be involved, but the rest of the investment would be mostly of American investors. Here, I am assuming that there would be a judgment of what would happen to European investment in Cuba, which have broken the rules of the Organization of the International Labor Organization, and may be open to a number of suits that would be placed for oppressing Cuban labor. So I imagine that the United States would be advantaged by the fact that many of those European investors and other Latin American investors, which are the minority, will have to practically flee Cuba. Then if we go into telecommunications, the expansion in telecommunications would be incredible. And right now, the Cuban Texa, which handles all of that communications, is partly owned by Telecom Italia. You would expect that the Americans will pick up at least that percentage and maybe more investment in which maybe Cuban Americans will be involved as well. So I think if you look at the basic infrastructure, the basic services that will be provided, construction services, so on and so forth, you would have in the first 8 years, I would say, you have to look at it in terms of 8 years, there will be a tremendous expansion of activity in Cuba, not only in production and exports, a large amount of imports coming basically from the United States, which in general, for example, can put wheat flour wheat and wheat flour in Cuba 10% cheaper than the exported from Europe right now and exported from the Far East. I think there will be tremendous opportunities for imports, exports, investments, and of course privatizations. Many of these sectors, like Cubana Aviación, will be privatized, which means that the government would have resources to be able to continue providing some of the basic social services in Cuba. At that point, of course, I refer myself to the Herencia article about the freedom of prices, the establishment of markets, and so on in Cuba in a macroeconomic point of view. Now, let's look at the agricultural side. Now, the important thing here would be what would happen to the production of sugar, and you would be expecting not only sugar, but also ethanol and many other byproducts of the sugar industry, which will be reestablished in Cuba without any problem. Of course, I'm talking again of a space of time which is between 3 years at the minimum and 8 years as the maximum. So we're not talking about something that is immediate. It will take time, and there will be, by the way, a number of bottlenecks, like railways, roads, electricity, cargoes through ports and through airports. All of that would have bottlenecks that would have to be broken at the beginning, and it would probably take that amount of time, 3 years, to be able to have a smooth sailing for many of these goods and services into Cuba. But it will happen. And Cuba will export not only sugar, but also, because that's part of the World Trade Organization, provides Cuba the possibility of reopening its previous foray in the market of sugar in the United States. They will have to provide a quota of a certain amount to Cuba, and of course the big picture here will be ethanol. The exports of ethanol to the United States will be considerable. I am assuming, by the way, that Cuba will be part of the either NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Area, or would have a free trade agreement with the United States, which will, of course, make things much simpler and facilitate the exchange that I'm looking at, and that I've studied, and I can see that it's entirely possible. Now, tropical fruits and winter vegetables. Cuba used to export about 50% of all the winter vegetables that were consumed in the United States and Canada. 50%. Now that was completely abolished with the regime that Carlos Quijano has very well described. That will come on. It will take, again, 3 years at minimum. You would have to go through phytosanitary restrictions. The primary secretary would have to approve all of those imports. But remember all of the tomatoes and cucumbers and pineapples and grapefruit, all the white grapefruits that were consumed in the United States and Canada came from Cuba before 1959. So there will be an expansion also of other products that come from agriculture, and a lot of investments in cattle, in hogs, chicken, which was in the case of chicken and hogs, there will be a lot of feedstocks that will have to be improved and imported and so on and so forth. I see the possibility of a tremendous expansion also in textiles. Cuba will probably go again into that type of activity, economic activity, which it had in the well established in the 1950s, with perhaps American investment and perhaps export textiles to the United States. Now, going into other industrial products, since I began already into some of them indirectly through textiles, which have an agricultural base, as you well understand. If you look at the other industrial products, you see that Cuba has the possibility probably of exporting cement to the United States in respectable quantities, of exporting steel to the United States in respectable quantities. Pharmaceutical products, and I see the time is really betraying me. Pharmaceutical products, sporting goods, and other industrial goods that do not stop there. Cuba would be the best place that the United States could establish for the famous twin or plants of production sharing. It would have the possibility of having part of the activities of a particular product be established in Cuba, in free trade zones, which the first one was established in 1953, I think in Isle of Pines and so on. I think we would have a tremendous opportunity for electronic goods, for pharmaceutical products. All of the research that has been done in medical technology in Cuba will finally bear fruit. There are many companies that will be interested in intra-company trade, establishing exchanges with Cuba, and doing some research in Cuba and selling those products to the Caribbean, the rest of Latin America. I really think that it will take time, but I don't have any doubt that Cuba will regain the rate of growth that it had in the 1950s, maybe 3, at the most 5 years after a change in regime. Of course, I have to stress that all of this implies that Cuba has to completely tie itself to the Western countries, and particularly to the United States. It is only through the United States that we will have, and that appears in the Herencia article, the wherewithal in terms of the financing and the investment and the loans that would have to be given in Cuba, which would give a support to the privatizations, and that will help the government to establish some of these expansions that I have mentioned in agriculture, industry, and service. Thank you so much.